Hi again, it's Jeff, your ProtoPie expert answering your ProtoPie questions. Today's question comes from Doyle. Doyle asks, is there a way to detect every single text of every single input when inputs are instances of a master component? Yeah, this is possible, and I'm going to show you how to do it. In my Pi here, I have a simple form that asks for first name, last name, and email address, and I've got some logic in here that makes sure that all three of these fields are filled when I hit the submit button. If they're not filled, then I get an error message. If they are filled, it takes me to scene 2. So let's just see this in action here. So if I just hit the submit button, I get this error message, all fields are required, and I have to put something in all fields. So if I only put something in the first one, it doesn't let me go, but if I put something in every single field, all right, it takes me to scene 2. And this is great when your input fields are part of your main scene. And you can see I've got my logic here is looking at the value of the text field or the text property of each of these input fields. Now, you might have a design system, or you just may have a component that mimics an input field, but that does a whole lot more things. So for example, I have a component here of an input field that mimics a material design input field. So it does a little bit more. And if we go into the component here, you're going to see it does some stuff on focus in and focus out. And let's go back to our scene. Let's go see it in action. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull out 3 of them here and replace my basic text fields with instances of this component here. So let's remove first name, last name, and email address, and we'll rename these. First name, last name, email address. And these labels, you can modify them just by double-clicking them. All right, now if I preview this, you're going to see it behaves like a material design input. When I focus it, the label kind of shrinks up into the corner and I can type something in the field. It changes color when it's focused. So it looks like something you'd see on any material design enabled website. Now the biggest drawback here is even though I've filled all 3 of these and I hit submit, it's not letting me go. All fields are required. And the reason for that is in my condition here, it's looking for a text property of an input field, and there are no input fields here to choose from. I can look at any of these components, and I have all the basic properties of the component, that kind of thing, but I don't have access to the actual input field itself underneath and its text value property. So how do I get that information? How do I know if these have been filled? What we're going to do is we're going to use send and receive to send messages from these components to the scene whenever the value inside the input field changes. So let's go into our component. We can edit the component by double clicking it in the components panel over here. And we have logic when it focuses in and logic when it focuses out. We don't have any logic for when the text value changes. So let's take care of that. I'm going to add a trigger, and I'm going to add a detect trigger, and this will be on the input field's text property. And anytime the text property of the input field changes, this trigger will fire. So we'll say detect input text. And what I'm going to do is every time that text property changes, I want to send that value to the scene. So I'm going to use the send response. And instead of current scene, I'm going to do send to parent. And I'm going to show you what the difference is between these two in a second. But just for now, just follow along. I'm going to use send to parent. And the message I'm going to say is input text. Call it anything you like, doesn't really matter. I'm going to call it input text. And I'm going to send a value. I'm going to send whatever happens to be in the input field. So if I make a formula here and I press a little plus, I can select the input fields. And then if I hit the dot character, I can choose the text property of the input field. Now, anytime the value of the text property of the input field changes, this message input text will be sent to the parent. And in our case, the parent is the main scene. The parent is always whatever contains that component. So in the case of, if I go back to scene 1, this is a child of scene 1. Scene 1 is the parent. If I had nested components, let's say I had another component within this component, and I wanted to send from the nested component to its parent would be this component here. In my scene here, now I want to change my logic. So instead of checking the value of the input fields directly, What I want to do is I want to capture. I want to capture the values of each of these, and then in my comparison, I want to compare those captured values and make sure they're not empty. So we made a send trigger over here, and let's rename this so it says input text. I like to rename all my responses in triggers so I know what's going on. And in here, let's add a receive. And I'm going to add a receive for each one of these. So a receive for first name, a receive for last name, and a receive for email address. So let's do an add trigger. It'll be receive from component, because I want to receive from a specific one. And again, I'm going to go through what the difference is because we're going to do another one for the focus that'll be to the scene. So you can see how the behavior is different. But in this case, I want to receive directly from the first name component. And the message is input text. And you'll see when I click on the box here, I get a short list of all the messages that are sent to the parent. And in this case, it's just input text. And I want to assign it to a variable. Now, in this case, I don't have any variables to assign it to, so I need to create one. Let's create one for the scene. I'm going to call it first name, and it needs to be a text variable because I'm getting text back from that input field. So text. And in my receive, I'm going to assign it to that first name variable. So receive input text from first name. And as you can imagine, I'm going to make two more just like this, but for each of the other component instances. So let's duplicate this. Command D or Control D on Windows, and we'll just make some modifications here. So instead of receiving from first name, I'm going to receive from last name. And let's rename this so it matches accordingly. And I don't want it to go to the first name variable. I want it to go to a different variable. This one will be last name. For this scene, last name. This will be text, and in my receive here, I'm going to change this to last name, and I'm going to do this again for email address. So let me just make another variable here, email address. It is a text variable, and I just want to make sure that all three of these are text variables, which they are. And let's duplicate this guy. And instead of last name, this will be from email address, and I would like to rename this accordingly. And I'm going to assign this to email address. Now, if you are unsure that this is actually going to work, what we can do is we can turn on the debug for each of these variables. So I'm going to hit this little ladybug icon beside each of the variables, and you get this green box that shows up in the top corner here. So this will update as it changes in your scene. So I've got first name, last name, and email address. Let's actually just stack them like this. And now if I preview this, if I start typing into first name, you can see the first name variable is updating. Last name should work the same way, and email address should work the same way. So now I can just do a comparison on what's contained in these variables. If all three of these variables are not empty, then I can allow submit to continue. Otherwise, I want to show that error message. So let's just change our condition over here. So in the tap trigger for the submit button, I have a condition. And instead of looking at the text property of the input field, I want to look at the value of that variable. So I'm going to change this to first name, and I'm going to change this to last name, and I'm going to change this to email address. All right, now this should work. If I hit submit, it tells me all fields are required, and if I just fill in one, I get the same error message, but let's fill in all three. It allows me to go to the third scene. All right, that's working. Now there's one little extra quirk in here that I want to take care of. So when I put something in here, but I don't put anything in the other ones and the error message comes up, I'd like that error message to disappear when I focus one of these input fields. So when I tap here, I want this message to go away. So that way, if the message has to come back, you can see it come back at the point when you hit the submit button. Right now, it's not doing that. And I don't have a way to, in the same way I don't have a way to detect the text value of that input field, I can't put a focus trigger on the input field here either because it's nested inside the component. So again, I have to handle this from inside the component. So let's go back into the component. And I already have a focus trigger for this input field. And what I can do is I can just add a send message in that focus trigger. So let's do that. I'm going to send. And in this time, I'm going to use current scene, and I'm going to show you how they differ. So send to current scene the message will be focus. And I'm not going to send the value along here because there isn't a value to pass along. It's just going to be the message focus. And let's send focus. And let's go back to our scene. And I'm going to set up a receive trigger. And this will be from current scene, and it'll be focus. And when I receive focus, I want to hide this error message. So I'm going to take this, copy it, put it in my receive focus, and let's rename this receive focus. And now anytime, the difference between send to parent and receive from component versus send to scene and receive from scene is that this is a specific instance of the component sending a message to the scene, and the scene has to listen on that specific instance. So you'll notice that when I put something into the first name, only the first name variable is getting filled here. Only this one will make a change when that first one changes. And similarly, if I put something into the second field, it's going into the second variable, but it's not touching the first one. All of these operate independently when you send to parent and receive from component. And it's like when it's a specific component instance. When you're sending to the scene, it's almost like a broadcast. It's sending to everybody in the room. So any component that sends to the scene will be heard by the single receive that is listening to the scene. So in this case, if we preview this, and we'll hit the submit button to bring up our error message. And if I click on any of these fields, you'll notice the error message went away. And similarly, if I hit submit again and I tap on the first one, all three of these are sending a message to the scene, and there's a single receive listening on the scene. So a good analogy I like to use is, let's say you've got a room full of people. If I do a send to a particular send from a particular component to the parent, that's like somebody whispering in somebody's ear. Only that one person's going to hear it, and only that one person's going to do something about it. The send to the scene is like getting on a soapbox with a megaphone and yelling to everybody in the room. Everybody's going to hear it, and therefore everything gets responded to. So specific message from the component to the parent, listening to that particular component instance and doing something with it. Receiving on any component because they're all sending to the scene. And there you go, easy as pie. If you've run into a snag with one of your pies and you'd like to ask for help, just check out the link in the description below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.